Evening. Thank you for joining us for our annual board retreat. It's February 24th, 2021. Public notice of this meeting pursuant to the Open Public Meetings Act has been given by the board secretary in the following manner. Posting written notice on the official school bulletin board at the administration building on February 17th, 2021. Transmitted notice to the Courier Post and Philadelphia Inquirer on February 17th, 2021. Transmitted notice to the clerk of Cherry Hill Township on February 17th, 2021. And if you would, please rise with me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay. Let's turn it to Mrs. Sugars.
Mrs. Arroyo. Mrs. Stratton.
Here.
Ms. Friedel.
Here.
Mrs. Matlack.
Here.
Mr. Avadia.
Here.
Mrs. Schultz.
Here.
Mrs. Stern.
Here.
Mrs. Tong.
Here.
Mrs. Neary.
Here. Okay, great, thank you. So this is our annual board retreat. Gwen Thornton from NJSBA is joining us to go over our code of ethics and board norms. Gwen, you want to? Okay.
I will. I think I have unmuted myself successfully here. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you. It's nice to see some familiar faces as well as some new faces. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a field service representative with New Jersey School Boards. And just by way of a little history, I've been doing this work with the association now. I'm going into my 19th year, which is very hard for me to believe. Prior to that, I was a member of the Board of Education and president of the board in Bridgewater, Raritan, which is in Somerset County, for close to a decade. And 100 years ago BC, that would be before my children, I was a high school teacher and president of the Teachers Association before I retired to stay home and raise my children for a couple of years. And then I got involved in PTA and PTO and school boards, and I'm here. That's sort of just a brief history. So I have sat where you're sitting, and I have worked with Cherry Hill when I started with the association 19 years ago. We had a field office in Voorhees, which is not far from Cherry Hill, and I actually lived in Haddonfield, which is directly adjacent to Cherry Hill. But we were from the central part of the state, and when my husband retired, we moved back to this part of the state. But Cherry Hill requested that I stay with them, which I was very honored to be asked. And so I have remained your field service representative, even though I don't currently serve all of Camden County. And so I'm here this evening to do your annual ethics training. And I'm assuming that I can share the screen. When I do that, I will just do it for the ethics presentation. And then when we do norms, I will stop sharing the screen so that we can do that together face to face, because I think that's more helpful. I am happy to, if you raise your hand or unmute yourself, I would be happy to answer any questions that you have as I go along. I'd really rather have a discussion with you than talk at you. I'd prefer to talk with you. And there is no question that is silly or that you shouldn't ask if you have it. So please feel free to ask me anything. If I don't have an answer, I will find someone in the association and get you an answer if I don't have one. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this works. It generally works pretty well. Often. We'll see if that, let me try that again. I don't think you can see that yet, can you? Hang on, bear with me. Will I find you again? And do share screen. It's here. And we'll share. And we'll go from the beginning and not the end. Now I think you should be able to see it. Okay.
Yes.
Good. Thank you for letting me know that. So One of the requirements for Board of Education members on an annual basis is to engage in training around the School Ethics Act. And the School Ethics Act is actually embodied in New Jersey 18A 12-23.1, meaning that it's actually in statute in law. And it really does specify the standards of conduct that board members must adhere to. And it really is designed to maintain the respect and confidence of the people in your community that you serve, and to ensure that board members avoid contact that could be potentially perceived as a violation of the public trust or create a justifiable impression that the public trust was being violated. The Code of Ethics originally came out of our delegate assembly long before the act was put into statute, but the legislature saw fit to put it into statute and it did become law. These provisions also apply to all charter school trustees, as well as school administrators and school leaders all across every district in the state of New Jersey. In addition to being part of the statute, it is also part of NJQSAC, which is the New Jersey Quality Single Accountability Continuum. For those of you who are new board members, you will find that in education, we use a million acronyms. And if I use one that you don't recognize, please stop me. I would be happy to explain what they are. Sometimes I forget because we use them so often. And in the governance DPR, District Performance Review of the monitoring system, there is an indicator that spells out that you need annual training around the Code of Ethics, that you have to complete a financial disclosure form, and that you will also ensure that there is no board member or administrator in the district who is in violation of the School Ethics Act as determined by the School Ethics Commission. The financial disclosure forms should have been out by now. We discussed it this morning in a general staff meeting. They're a little behind at the Department of Education. You should be receiving an email from the Department of Ed, from the School Ethics Commission, to fill out your financial disclosure forms. Be glad that it's coming. They forgot us all together because they changed platforms. We as professional staff members fill out financial disclosure forms and sign the Code of Ethics the same way all of you do as staff members of NJSBA. So the School Ethics Act, once it was established, also created an ethics commission. It outlines what are considered to be conflicts of interest that you should avoid. It requires, of course, your personal financial disclosure statement that you will be filling out online. And it also was added later on mandatory training for Board of Education members, which some of you may already be familiar with. So we're going to go through all of these various pieces and talk a little bit about what each of them mean to you as a Board of Education member. So the School Ethics Commission meets once a month. It has 9 members. They're appointed by the governor. They sit for a 3-year term, and no more than 5 can be from any one political party. The concept here is that since school board elections are nonpartisan, meaning they are not aligned to either political party, that the School Ethics Commission should reflect that nonpartisan basis as well. There are 2 school board members. There are 5 non-school officials, citizens, that the governor chooses to sit there. And additionally, there are 2 school administrators. Currently, they are only 6 members of the board right now, of the commission. They are missing 1 board member and 2 public seats that are not filled. Governor Murphy, I think, has been very busy with the pandemic and the state of the state, but we are optimistic that he will fill those seats shortly so they will be at full strength. It's important to note that they have to have at least 6 members to issue advisory opinions, and I'll talk about what an advisory opinion is in a moment, okay? In terms of mandatory training, just to make it simple, if you are a brand new board member, you and some of you I know are, you're required to attend new board member orientation. It is available online or in person. It used to be that we would run several new board member orientation weekends, but because of the pandemic, that's not possible this year. So it is available online. And that the laws, various different laws outline that new board members must learn about CUSAC, that monitoring system, the evaluations process for your superintendent, HIB, harassment, intimidation, and bullying, Open Public Meetings Act, which we just referred to as OPMA, and OPRA, which is the Open Public Records Act. There's also a lot of other information you would receive at new board member orientation around the board's role in curriculum and instruction and finance, in policy, around advocacy. But those pieces that I just went through around CUSAC and evaluation and HIB are all required components for new board member orientation. And then years 2 and 3 of the very first term that you serve as a board member, you must attend mandated training. Year 2 is on school finance. Year 3 is on student achievement. There are several of those scheduled, I know, through the rest of the year. There's one in March, I think the 9th, which is Gov 2, 3, and 4. So if you need to attend those, certainly all you have to do is have your business administrator sign you up. There is no charge to the district. The reason we have your business administrator sign you up is because we are accountable to the School Ethics Commission to report board members who have attended. So you are not found to be out of compliance with mandated training. If you are reelected in the first year of any reelected term, meaning year 4, year 8, and so forth, you must attend Gov 4, and it really is just an update on the laws, anything that has changed, and other kinds of appropriate information for experienced board members around pieces that may have changed. So those are the training components. I'm proud to say we belong to National School Boards Association, and I work with an organization of trainers all across the country. New Jersey has the most educated board members in the country. And that's something I think that is beneficial, and it shows in the educational programs and offerings that school districts across the state offer. And that's one of the reasons we are one of the top states in providing education to students across the country. The School Ethics Commission has 2 functions. They issue advisory opinions, and they also adjudicate ethics complaints. Advisory opinions are given on a prospective basis. So as a board member, if there's a circumstance where there's a proposed activity or a topic or discussion or a vote that you know is coming up and you think you may have a conflict or there may be an issue with it, you can write to the School Ethics Commission and request their advisory opinion, their advice as to whether you can participate or whether you should recuse yourself from discussion and voting. Sometimes advisory opinions are of such note and they have widespread application for board members across the state that the School Ethics Commission will make an advisory opinion public. When they do that, they remove the district name from the decision. They remove any board members' names from the decisions and just advise board members all across the state. We always publish any new advisory opinions in school board notes, which you probably receive electronically. It's always good to just, even if you don't read all of the articles in school board notes every week when they come out, if you breeze through there, you will see that there are occasionally ethics decisions and all public advisory opinions are there as well. We also, on an annual basis, try to highlight any advisory opinions that are recent in the last year so that you are kept up to date and abreast of those. The Ethics Commission will also adjudicate any ethics complaint that is filed against a Board of Education member, and anyone can file an ethics complaint against a Board of Education member, a member of the public, a member of the public from another community, another board member. So you need to be aware of that and that's something that is important. In 2020, just to give you some sense of the work that was accomplished by the Ethics Commission, They issued only one advisory opinion that was made public. They did provide 21 advisory opinions to board members that were not made public, gave them advice on a prospective basis so that those board members knew what to do. In terms of mandatory training violations, there were 22 cases. They removed permanently from the board 8 members for failure to comply with mandatory training. They suspended 4 board members for 30 days each for being very late in taking it, and they reprimanded 10 members for being late. So you can see that they have authority over board members. They can suspend you, they can remove you, they can reprimand you, or they can censure you, and we'll talk about what each of those means. There were 24 complaints brought against board members in 2020. Of those ethics complaint, 20 were dismissed. Typically, cases are dismissed for a failure to provide adequate support for the complaint. And then there were 4 cases that were recommended to move forward where board members were found adjudged to have violated the code of ethics. In those instances, the SEC recommends to the commissioner what they believe is the appropriate penalty for the violation, and it is up to the commissioner to make that final decision on what the penalty is for the violation. So the one advisory opinion, and here it is an important one. In this one, the superintendent's sister-in-law, his brother's wife, was a lunch aide in the district, and she was there before the superintendent was hired by this district. So she was an employee of the school district prior to the superintendent coming to that district. The wife, sister-in-law, was selected by principals to be a finalist for a secretarial position, which was obviously a promotion from going from a lunch aide to being a secretary. And the superintendent wanted to know from the SEC if it was fair to prohibit a qualified and vetted employee to move into a different position only because her brother-in-law was the superintendent. Now, you may or may not be aware that all districts have a nepotism policy that says that the superintendent may not recommend any board member's family member or a member of his or her family for employment in the district. And so that's why the superintendent had the question, because he would have had to recommend this sister-in-law for the new position. And the nepotism policies specifically prohibit a superintendent from being able to do that. The SEC advised the superintendent that he could not, unfortunately for his sister-in-law, promote her to the new position because it would give the public the impression that he was providing an unwarranted privilege or advantage or employment for a family member, and again, would leave the impression that the public trust was being violated. And it reminded the superintendent as well that he had to recuse himself from any discussion on his sister-in-law's employment as a lunch aide. So there are instances where these kinds of things help to inform all of us that no superintendent can recommend, even if they're employed prior to your getting there, for promotion. And that's because of the nepotism policies. So in terms of the violation of the act itself, as I said earlier, you can be reprimanded for a violation, and that's simply a letter of rebuke from the commissioner. You can be censured, which is that letter of rebuke, but it also requires that it be read aloud and adopted as a resolution by the Board of Education, meaning that it gets made public. You can be suspended. The length is recommended by the SEC, but the commissioner has the final decision on whether the suspension is long, too short, and removal. They certainly have done this in the past, and they can remove from office for the remaining length of a term of office. So the SEC recommends to the commissioner for a final decision. Sometimes board members will appeal a decision. If they do so, it is heard by the Appellate Division of Courts in the state of New Jersey. There is a protection for board members in that if a frivolous complaint is brought, they may be fined up to $500. So I know that you might find this hard to believe, but this actually happened in Cherry Hill many, many, many moons ago, prior to and during election season. There were a couple of frivolous complaints that were filed against candidates and who were incumbent board members. And those folks who filed were fined for filing frivolous complaints. So it is protection for Board of Education members that piece is in the law, so that it discourages individuals from filing against board members for an arbitrary or capricious or frivolous way. Okay, here's the actual code of ethics. You are required to uphold and enforce all laws, rules, regulations of the state of New Jersey, the State Board of Education, and any kinds of court cases and decisions that set precedents and become in de facto part of the law. You are elected by your community, but your authority is derived from the legislature. And that's something that you need to understand, that you are state officials. Even though you serve on a local level in Cherry Hill, your power comes from the state of New Jersey. You're required to make decisions in terms of the educational welfare of all children and to meet the needs of those children as best as you can within the means and circumstances of your district. You're required to confine your board action to policy making, planning, and appraisal. You are, by definition, a policy-making body. Policy is critically important. It provides a framework for all stakeholders in your district, your students, your staff, your administrators, your community members, and your parents for understanding how the district is run, how it operates, what the expectations are. And so policymaking is critically important. You engage in planning by assisting and through the budget process, through the superintendent evaluation, which is really the appraisal piece, through goal setting, developing strategic plans. If you haven't done that, or if you have one in place, that's part of the planning end of your responsibility. You are not permitted to administer the schools, which means simply that the day-to-day operation of the school districts is the purview of your administration. You are really the what folks. You are the ones who set the vision and translate the community's aspirations for its children, what students need to know and be able to do. And then your administration is charged with making that happen. You are not there to make the day-to-day operational decisions of the school district. And probably this has come to the fore most recently. We're seeing it all across the state. I'm sure Cherry Hill is not particularly different than in any other district in this regard. But the decisions around hybrid, remote, returning, all of those pieces are administrative decisions. They are operational in nature. They are not the responsibility of the board to make those decisions. That would get into administering the schools. So that is not your job. Your job is to see with your colleagues that they are well run. You do that through holding your superintendent accountable on an annual basis in his or her evaluation. You have but one employee, and that's the superintendent. The superintendent is responsible to the board. He or she holds all other staff accountable. You must recognize that authority rests with the Board of Education and make no personal promises that would compromise or otherwise create issues for the board. Again, the Board of Education operates by majority. Once the board reaches a decision, that is what happens, and the district moves forward. You are not problem solvers. You cannot move a child from one class to another. Sometimes parents, community members will get in touch with you and want assistance. The very best thing that you can do as a board member is listen empathetically and then advise the parent or the community member along the chain of command, who they need to speak to get their issue addressed. So if it's a classroom concern, you start always with the lowest level and say, have you spoken to the child's teacher? If you're not satisfied with that resolution, you would then talk to the principal. If you're still not satisfied with that resolution, then you might speak to a supervisor or an assistant superintendent. The board is really the court of last resort for solving issues. That is not what you do. You cannot solve folks' issues, but you can give them access. Tell them how to get their problem solved in the sense that you explain to them how and who to contact to begin that resolution process, whether it's a citizen. So if they call with a budget question or a concern, you would guide them to the business office so that the board secretary would be able to respond to that appropriately. So that is an important piece to understand, that there's a chain of command that as board members, you must abide by as well, but your staff abides by that chain of command, and the community sometimes doesn't know that there is a chain of command, but you can help them to understand it and give them access so that you can help them. And that is the way that you can help them, but you cannot actually solve their problem. You're required to uphold confidentiality, meaning anything that is discussed in executive session must remain confidential until such time as the need for confidentiality no longer exists. Confidential minutes are kept, and when the need for confidentiality no longer exists, those minutes, there's a process by which those minutes become public. But board members should never disclose confidential information, particularly when it comes to students and staff, because when you do, it can cause damage to the staff or to the students, and it can open the district to liability issues that you don't want to have happen if that information were to become public. And that information will never become public. But there are some confidential pieces that will. So for example, if you're negotiating a new contract with a bargaining unit over the course of negotiations, that information is confidential, but once the contract is settled, the need for confidentiality no longer exists and it becomes public. We've already talked a little bit about interpreting your community's aspirations. It's really about knowing as a board what your vision for the future is, where you are today, and where you want to see the district go in terms of what it is providing for students. Refusing to surrender your independent judgment. Again, you are there to represent all the children, not a particular interest group, not the ice hockey parents, not the magical singers parents, students, not the debate team parents and students, but all students. And so you must not surrender your judgment to that kind of pressure or use the schools for any kind of personal gain. You're required to vote to appoint the best qualified personnel after consideration of your superintendent's recommendations. That does not mean that you have to vote yes on every single personnel recommendation. It does mean you have to consider the superintendent's recommendation in the area of personnel. Board members can vote no on a recommendation to hire someone as long as their rationale, and this is in the law, is not arbitrary or capricious, okay? And it's interesting to note that if you do not vote to approve the CSA's recommendation for an individual to be hired, the CSA will bring you back someone else that he or she recommends. The board can't vote no and then say, we want you to hire John Smith. The board only can appoint individuals to be employees of the district with the affirmative recommendation of the superintendent. So your authority in that area is pretty limited by statute and regulation, okay? You're required to support and protect staff in the proper performance of their duties. Before you became a board member, if you wanted to sit on the sidelines of the soccer game and complain about the coach because he hadn't played your child for enough minutes, that was fine. But now that you're a Board of Education member, you can't sit on the sidelines and complain about the coach because he is an employee of the district and you have to protect them in the proper performance of their duties. If you have a concern about a staff member or an issue connected to a staff member, you would simply notify your superintendent because the next one is right there. You have to refer all complaints, including your own perhaps, to the Chief School Administrative Officer, which is your superintendent. And the board only acts after the failure of an administrative solution, meaning that your superintendent has to be given the opportunity to solve whatever problem there may be, and then only then would it come before the board. Sometimes board members will say to me, well, I thought if I could try to resolve it at the beginning, it wouldn't get to the board. But if you involve yourself and engage yourself in trying to solve an issue inappropriately and it gets to the board, you would have to recuse yourself and not be able to participate. And so that is something that you can say to folks if they say, well, why can't you solve this problem for me? Sometimes the public does not understand the limitations of your role and what your responsibilities are. So you can help to provide them with that information by explaining that the board only gets involved after the failure of an administrative solution. And here are all these steps you need to take before it would come before us as a Board of Education.
Gwen?
Yes.
Miss Elmore Stratton has her hand up.
Okay. Ms. Stratton, if you unmute yourself, I can answer your question.
I was just gonna ask, can you clarify, like, what if we have a concern as a parent? Are we allowed to go to our own kid's teacher and,
Absolutely.
or-
So that's a question that is asked often. As a parent, you are always and forever your child's first and best advocate. And so you certainly are and are encouraged to work with your child's teacher to get accomplished whatever you need to get accomplished to solve whatever problem or issue that your child may be having in school or a concern that you may have. And you would follow that same chain of command as any parent in the school district. But I will tell you that once you become a board member, the staff knows you are a board member and they view you differently. I like to think of it as akin to the Scarlet A, but think of it as a B on the front of your forehead that's sort of tattooed there. Your staff knows that you're a board member, and so you need to be very clear that when you are in the school and speaking to a staff member, that you are there as Johnny's parent, as Susie's parent, and you're there to try to resolve a concern that you have. But you would work through the process that very same way that any other parent would work through as a parent. Okay?
And then I had another question, Ms. Thornton.
Yes, please.
When you talked about, like, when you could say no to a vote, or I guess abstain to a vote, but what is, like, the rule for, like,
excuse me,
something is on the docket of that has our own kids' teachers in it or something, right? Like, I don't do, and I'm always worried, like, do I abstain or say yes? Because I see my kid's history teacher on there, and that might be like the same teacher he's going to ask a recommendation for. Like, I don't want anything to be muddled. So then I'm like, I abstain because I know 3 people on here. Like, I don't know what to do in that.
Okay. So typically you would only be required to abstain if your child was deriving a benefit that was of greater value than was available to all other students. So if it's just voting to renew a teacher that your child has had, all children in the district could have had that child, that is fine. There's no conflict there. It is only if your child were being granted an advantage or some kind of special consideration that was not available to all other children that it would be a potential conflict. If a teacher, all students ask their favorite teachers for a recommendation for college. Most teachers are honored by that. That is not by definition a legal conflict.
Okay. And then one last
Okay.
question, and then I'm done. So,
Okay, that's okay.
also with the HR, I often, I'm, because I didn't know yet and I was waiting for this part, I abstain sometimes when I see names of people that because I used to work in the district a bajillion years ago. And these are people that I've carried out, like now have personal relationships with. So I never want that to be muddled. So sometimes I abstain, like if I see someone that I, worked in the building with and now our friends play together and that's like a good friend of mine, so should I not be doing that? Or I don't know. I just was saying abstaining to make sure it's never muddy.
Okay, there's two pieces. There's the legal piece and there's the perception piece, okay? So if it's your best friend and everyone in town knows it's your best friend, you may want to abstain from a perception standpoint, not a legal standpoint. You have to maintain your independent judgment. And so you need to ask yourself, can I be objective about this person, or am I too closely tied to this individual to not be able to be objective? In which case, I would recommend abstaining, okay? Or if you think the public will perceive that it's a conflict, I would abstain, because there's the law and then there's perception. And perception is reality. So perception can be as important as the legal piece. I don't see it as a legal issue. I see it as a public perception issue, especially if you're a former employee and you worked in the building together and you were next door to each other in classrooms, or whatever the circumstance may be. You might want to abstain from a perception perspective in that instance. Does that answer your question?
Yep, perfect. Thank you.
When
Okay.
Ms. Stern has her hand up?
Hi.
Hi, thanks so much. So I have a question that is not at all a situation current in any way, but my framework is coming from my own professional career, and we have reporting responsibilities in my career and in my line of work, and we have certain parameters that are pretty clearly outlined that mandate us to report on other professionals in our career, licensed professionals. So I'm just wondering, I'm surprised to learn about the piece about staff, if there's a known issue that, related to staff. And I'm assuming it's something pretty egregious, but I just wonder if there are any parameters, because that hadn't crossed my mind. So I'm trying to conceptualize what that might be.
You would notify the superintendent.
Understood, but are there, I mean, I can imagine like a crime that harms somebody would be a reason, but are there other parameters, and that would be violation of, I don't know, I'm just pulling something out of the air, drug use in the school. I mean, whatever.
Any concern that raises to a level that makes you uncomfortable as a parent, as a board member, as a citizen, if see something, say something. The first rule of effective board governance is no surprises. So if you see something that you find, what's the worst that can happen? Your superintendent says, you know what, I've already taken care of that, or I'm aware of it and it's been solved and addressed. No harm, no foul. But better than having someone be surprised or have an emergent circumstance that's not addressed. Clearly, if you saw an emergent circumstance, dropping your child off, picking him up from school, call on the cell phone, leave a message, send an informational email if you have to. Although again, I would caution you that in another type of presentation, and we'll talk a little bit about it when we talk about some of the cases, and that's the use of social media and the use of emails and the caution that board members need to use around that particular piece for a number of reasons. But certainly, leaving a voicemail, even if you can't reach someone. But the point is, board members are not there. So when you're a parent in a school and you see a cracked ceiling tile, or you see unsupervised students, it is not your job to go to the principal's office or find staff and direct staff. Board members only have one employee, and that's the superintendent, okay? If that's a concern to you, that you think there are unsupervised children, outside before the day begins or whatever, contact the superintendent and let him know and find out what the situation is. But you're not there to solve it. And you're not there to speak to the principal as a parent, right? You have one employee. So use your best judgment. I mean,
Okay.
use your professional experience to help inform your work. But board members sit on boards of education as lay people. So even though I was a high school teacher, and I was sure that I knew more about how to teach than, no, I'm kidding. I wasn't there to teach the teachers how to teach when I sat on my board. If you're an attorney, you're not the board's attorney. You can use your professional experience to help inform your work. If you're, an architect, you may have some ideas on ways that, the buildings could be updated or improved or whatever, but you're not the district's architect of record. You're a lay person when you sit on your board. And I think that's helpful to keep in mind as well.
Thank you. It really is. I have one other, I think it's a quick question. So I usually, if I can, I like to support, fundraisers and that kind of stuff in the district. And I'm just wondering, is that still okay? Can I try to, if it's, one high school, we have 3 high schools, I try to be consistent about now, especially, maybe all the high schools kind of doing the same thing. But
I recommend that board members fully support all public events at every one of the schools for every opportunity they can. Now, that being said, you also have a life, a job, and a family. I'm assuming you may have part of that, you may have all of that. I don't know, right?
and then some. No,
Different board members, different circumstances, but, I'm not saying, you should be out every night, at a different school, at a public event, but as many as you can support. Parents appreciate seeing you. Students are glad that you're there. It's also helpful because it provides us with perspective, which sometimes as board members we lose, and that is that we're there for kids. And sometimes boards get caught up in adult stuff and forget about the kids. So I think, as much as you can, like next week is Read Across America, Dr. Seuss, the 100th day. And a lot of board members are typically, many districts will invite at the elementary level parents to come in or board members to come in and read to the kids. There is a section in the ethics about volunteerism. We'll talk about it, but certainly anytime you were invited in for a district event, go do it if you can. Reading to the kids, I loved going in and reading to the kids at Read Across America when I was a board member. It was this piece we did, and I love doing it because it reminds me why we're there.
So just a follow up to that. So specifically what I'm also thinking about are things like, financially supporting like project graduation, like basically kind of a charitable donation, that kind of support.
And you certainly can provide
Okay.
financial support.
Okay.
Prior to becoming a board member, I was a founding member along with my husband of our educational foundation in our town that continues to this day. And so I continued to support the Ed Foundation the entire time that I was a board member. And certainly, you can support anything you want. The booster clubs, just don't handle their money.
Yeah, right.
As a board
No,
member.
none of that stuff, just literally
No.
as a.
Well, no, that's part of the volunteerism thing, right? Is you can volunteer, but you really should not be handling any kind of district funds. I'm just being, being funny, but certainly any amount of support that you can give the district in any way, even if it's just attendance, is wonderful. And it's nice for you to see the good things that you're doing and the good things that are happening in the school district. So we certainly recommend that as well.
And
And then-
Gwen, I think Mr. Ovadia had a question as well.
Yes, he does.
Yeah, Gwen, thanks so much for taking the time to address it. So
Absolutely.
tonight, really appreciate it. So two things I wanted to kind of get some perspective on, and they both have to do with what you just said about in terms of like thinking about the adults and the children. So interpret community aspirations. How do we think about that functionally as a board? I mean, we're not talking about direct democracy. Everything would
No.
go back to the public or anything. But the other thing that always is kind of an interesting one, I feel like, is the taxpayer. Like, where does the taxpayer sit for us? Obviously, we're accountable at some point to the voters, but like, a lot of times I feel like that's really not why we're here. But we need to consider
Here's my response, okay? If you consider every group in your community, every group has a voice. The voters at the ballot box, okay? The unions through their contracts and negotiations, okay? Again, most of the employees have an organization that represents them, so they have a voice, they have a process, okay? The only group that really doesn't have an organization that advocates on their behalf are the kids. The community elects you to represent the best interests of the children in a fiscally responsible manner, would be my response to you. And you as a group have to determine what that looks like. Now, it's always a balance between providing the greatest number and the greatest number of educational opportunities and experiences and co-curricular experiences for students, while balancing the ability of your community to support that financially. So it is a balance, and it's a balance that you as a board have to try to strike. Now, you're not alone in that process because there are limits. There is a 2% tax cap levy that was put into place with the School Funding Reform Act of 2008. Prior to that, and going back 100 years when I sat on my board, communities voted on the school budget. And if they voted the budget down, it then went to your municipal officials to reduce the budget to what they considered was reasonable. When they moved the school board elections from April, which is when all boards used to be elected, they were elected in April, they were reorganized and started a new board year in May. And the budget vote was along with the school board vote in April. But there was a deal cut at the legislature that if boards would move their elections from April to November, and the district kept its spending at or under that 2% tax cap levy increase, that the community would not have to vote on the budget. Most boards of education out of the 560 plus school districts immediately moved their elections from April to November because of the ability to then not have to go out and essentially sell their budget. When I was on the board, we used to call it the budget roadshow. And the superintendent and the business administrator and various members of the board, depending upon where we were going, would go out and promote the budget. And when I say promote, I should say inform and educate, because you had to provide accurate information, meaning you couldn't say it's not going to cost you any more money, when indeed it was going to cost them more money, right? You had to know the accurate numbers, you had to present factual information, you were informing, you weren't persuading. But essentially, it was a roadshow. And we used to do all of the faculty meeting, because there are always faculty who live in your community. And sometimes they are your best advocates for voting yes on a budget, because they're in the classrooms and they know what happens when budgets get cut by millions of dollars by municipalities. So, I mean, it's evolved over time. So, at the end of the day, it is up to the board in collaboration with your administration and reflecting on your community and its ability to pay. You know, we've been through some tough times this past year. You know, there's, I don't even know the numbers of people that have lost employment. You know, some communities have been severely affected by the pandemic. Some communities have been less affected by the pandemic. You know, I was on a board in a community when the economy went to pieces in a given year. I mean, just bottomed out and there was a recession. There was a lot of hidden unemployment because in a lot of suburban communities, people don't like to admit that they're unemployed, right? And so it wasn't really visible, but we knew it existed. And so, you know, we didn't go above our maximum net permissible budget. We stayed, you know, under it. But that's a discussion that the board needs to have among and between yourselves with your administration. What are our needs? What does it mean if we don't go to 2%? There's also banked cap. If in some years you don't use your 2% over a period of 3 years, in that year 3, you can go over cap using what you have banked, meaning the percentages in the other 2 years that were not at 2%. So, you know, there is some flexibility, but again, what I would say to you is you were elected by your community to represent the best interests of the children for providing the highest quality education and educational experiences you can in a fiscally responsible manner. And the board, and in knowing your community, which is, you know, from my perspective, boards of education come the closest, other than some town hall meetings from Vermont, to direct democracy, in that you live and reside in your community and represent that community, right? You represent all of the community. In most districts, you know, you're not elected by a ward, although we have some city districts where there are wards, right? And you represent the 3rd ward or the 4th ward. But in Cherry Hill, you represent East and West. And I lived in Haddonfield, and I lived in a district we had High School East and High School West, when never the twain shall meet. So I understand all about that. And I worked in Cherry Hill. And so I think that you, and in fairness, I will tell you, my daughter also, after she graduated, was an aide for a year before she went on to get her master's at Teachers College in Cherry Hill at the middle school. So I have great respect for what you do in your schools. But I think that that is what you have to keep in mind. That's how you reflect the community's vision. You know, you all have probably different constituencies. You go to different stores, you attend different religious institutions, or go to different sports games. You know, you may be a hockey parent or a soccer parent. You know, I had girls, so I tended to go to girls' sports events, not the boys' sports event. But, you know, like you all have different groups of people within your community that you talk to and know. And they help to inform what you know and think and do. But the whole concept of a board of education is that there is collective wisdom in the 9 different sets of backgrounds, voices, experiences, that together you will make the best decisions for the children in your community through that collaborative sharing of perspectives and viewpoints. No one expects boards to be bobbleheads, just all going yes and agreeing 100% of the time. You know, you can agree to disagree. You just have to agree to disagree amiably and disagree about the issues, not about each other. And that, I think, is, you know, some helpful pieces to think about as you work through some of the difficulties. I mean, it is a particularly challenging time right now. I don't think there's any community. I don't know any teacher. I don't know any administrator in the entire country that does not want their kids back in school full time, 5 days a week, with every activity available to them that existed prior to the pandemic. It's just not possible right now. And so there are a lot of very unhappy folks. And I get it, because kids are suffering in some way or shape. They're missing some pieces. And I don't mean just educationally, they can't see their friends. But you know, I just talked to a colleague who the schools were going fully open finally, 4 days a week on Monday, and on Sunday, the vice principal was taken to the hospital at 3 o'clock, and by 7, she was gone from COVID. She was 40 years old. And the school had to reopen without her the following day. So, this is something that continues. I think we've turned the corner. I'm optimistic that we've turned the corner for the fall. But I think it's made it more challenging, and a challenging time for especially new board members to come on board in this circumstance. It's never happened before, and crossing fingers, it's a once in any of our lifetimes, or any of your children's lifetime, or my grandchildren's lifetime, that this kind of condition prevails. And we will get through it. And from my perspective, all of you and all of your administrators and all of your teachers, no matter what, have been first responders for the kids, and should be appreciated and valued for that. They have worked nonstop since last March. And that doesn't mean that I don't think that the superintendents can't make mistakes, or board members can't make mistakes. I made mistakes as a board member. You gain a lot of perspective when time passes and you look back and think, why did I want that? Or why did I do that? But I think we have to be just gentle and kind with one another through the rest of this, because everyone is dealing with some level of uncertainty. People are disproportionately impacted, some more so than others. It's just a very challenging time. So, I think having training helps, especially for new board members, to understand what their role is. Some of these things come with time and understanding and time in the seat, believe it or not. It almost takes a full year. I used to say, when we would get folks to come to new board member orientation, I want to bring them all back after year 1, because you almost can't absorb everything, number 1. And number 2, you almost don't know what you don't know. But after 1 year of service, then all of a sudden, you know what you don't, you recognize that you don't know now you know what you don't know. And you can get answers to those questions. So that was very long-winded, and I apologize. But
That's great. Thank you.
I hope it was helpful. Anything else? Mrs. Schultz?
Hi, Gwen. First, I wanted to just thank you for your time in this presentation. I definitely learned something new every time you presented it. So thanks for coming tonight. Just
My pleasure.
Thanks. Yeah, quick question. Just in regards to the topic you were just talking about, does New Jersey school boards, did it have any advice for boards in regards to kind of navigating this conversation? Because it's definitely something that's going on throughout the entire state. So I would just be curious if there's any advice that New Jersey school boards could offer as far as like messaging and kind of just how to handle some of the conversations, because I'm sure they're not unique to Cherry Hill.
They are not unique to Cherry Hill. I think consistent messaging is important. I also think empathy is critical. And I think the consistent message that decisions are being based on the New Jersey Department of Health's recommendations, your local Department of Health's recommendations, the CDC guidelines, and that your primary focus is, and will always be the health and safety of your students and staff. And I know that that is not glitzy. It doesn't spin really well, but I think that it is the authentic, true message that you are giving folks, because it is the truth. Again, as a parent, I'm a grandparent, I was a teacher. I know what it is to teach kids. Teachers want their kids back. Parents want their kids back. Administrators want the children back in the buildings. It is what they love to do. And it's more difficult for the kids, and it's more difficult for the staff, the hybrid, the remote. So I think you can be consistent in that, and that changes that get made are not made arbitrarily or capriciously. They are made based on the best information that the district has that comports with the requirements of the local Department of Health, the State Department of Health, the State Department of Education's guidelines and recommendations, the recommendations of the Centers for Disease Control, and the ability of Cherry Hill to provide a safe, healthy environment for every child that is as safe as we can make it within the limitations that we have. I think one of the reasons that this has become such a hot item is because, unfortunately, I think we are prone to compare ourselves to other districts. And every district is unique. You have different age buildings, you have different populations, you have different busing configurations, you have different size cafeterias, you have different age staff members. You know, I have some very tiny, I cover Hunterdon County, which is a pretty remote, I don't know if you're familiar with it, rural county in the central part of the state, where there are numerous K6 districts and K8 districts, tiny. I have one of them that is about 80 kids. They have been in school 5 days a week since September. The building is a ranch style building. It's old enough that it has individual doors to the classrooms, okay? So that they don't have any centralized hallways. So kids are not passing. They can go in and out of school. They stay in their classrooms. The specials come to the kids as opposed to the, you know, kids going to an art room or going to a music room. And that was how they've worked to keep the kids in school, and they eat at their desks in the classroom, which requires all parents. And believe me, there were some parents who were unhappy about having to pack their kids' lunches, right? There was no, you know, meal service or food service to speak of. They just had to bring whatever they could, you know, put together for lunch. But they shared 4 teachers: art, music, phys ed, and world language. And in December, right before the holidays, after the Thanksgiving holidays, when there was that surge, one of the teachers that was shared among all classrooms became ill, which meant that all of her colleagues, then those 4 teachers who all shared every child, had to quarantine. And it meant that every child in the district had been exposed, okay? So they had to go remote. The board was beside itself. Now, that's a very unique circumstance. They had been very fortunate. They were in school full time, 5 days a week, September through right before the holiday, okay? And the board was very upset, and the community was upset, but they had to shut down. They had 3 substitutes for the entire school district, 2 of whom didn't come in. So they had no staffing, and they had 4 teachers out. So my point being in telling you this story is not to make you feel sorry for them or, wow, there's a district that's small, but just to make the point to you that every district is different. I have another district. There's not a building in their community that is under 70 years old. In fact, their high school is over 100 years old. But they have retrofitted and rehabbed every one of their buildings. It was a community decision not to knock them down and build new. And so they were able to go into hybrid, and they have been in hybrid almost this entire time because they had no ventilation issues, which has been a real problem in a lot of districts, especially in the northern part of the state, where buildings are really old in a lot of the cities because the buildings tend to be really old. And it's a ventilation issue that's preventing a lot of districts from being able to come back, right? It's not busing, it's not, you know, they can make it work were for the ventilation. They've been back. They've been very successful only because they had just done all of this rehabbing of their buildings and changed the ventilation systems and so forth. So they could comport with what they needed to do. But every district is different. And you can't compare what's going on in Haddonfield to Cherry Hill to Pennsauken, you know, to Moorestown, to any other district, because you're all different. I mean, you have some tiny districts, Somerdale, Audubon, you know, that may be able to have more kids in school perhaps than you've been able to have, or did it sooner, or did it differently. But no district can be compared to another district in this circumstance because it's all different. It's all different. And I think that is something that the communities may not be fully aware of, that comparing It's like trying to put apples and oranges and pears and grapes in the same bag and have it all, come out and be edible. It just doesn't work that way. So again, a long-winded answer to really say consistent messaging, listening to your parents, explaining as best you can the rationale for why you're doing what you're doing, and that it's really based on the health and safety of your students and your staff. If you don't have a staff, you can't bring them in. You can't bring the kids back. And there are lots of people out there, I joke that I went from boomer to zoomer overnight with having to go remote. There are a lot of teachers, who are not at the beginning of their career, who may have more years of experience, but have less comfort levels with a lot of the technology, with really struggling with remote learning and trying to engage kids. Making sure that we're not losing anyone, they're not falling between the cracks, ensuring that they're taking care of their social emotional needs as a teacher is critically important. And I think reminding parents that you are doing everything that you can to provide a broad-based education that is a quality education. Is there going to be, some kids are thriving in remote education. Some kids love it. There are other kids that it's really a struggle. I have districts that have prioritized special needs kids because some of those children just can't possibly be serviced remotely. And so those are the children that were brought back to district first because there's no way to do a lot of the kinds of fill the kinds of educational needs that they have in a remote environment. So, you're doing everything that you can for every child that you can all of the time. And I think just continuing to repeat that, while again, it's not glitzy and it's not going to make you a millionaire. I think it's important for parents to hear that from boards. And I don't think you can say it enough. As tiresome as it gets, I know at times, to listen, because you're helpless. You can't change. You can't make the pandemic go away. I can't. If I could, any of us would, to get the kids back in school full time and give them back some degree of normalcy. But I think boards also need to be forward thinking about what is this going to look like when we come back, and what are the kinds of things that we're going to have to provide to identify and assess where there may be, whether you want to call it learning slide, whether you want to call it learning loss. I have some folks that like to call it learning acceleration, because there has been learning going on, but how do we accelerate what they've learned to where they really need to be? And that's generally a term that's used more with gifted and G&T, gifted and talented, than perhaps with all students. But at the same time, I think that we need to be thinking about that for next year, and we need to be thinking about it now. And how are we going to provide for the social emotional issues that may be emerging? Because there are people in your community that are food insecure, that are housing insecure, whose incomes have been devastated. They may have lost family members. We can't possibly know all of the individual circumstances of every member of our communities, but we do know that people have been significantly impacted in traumatic ways, and the kids are going to reflect that. So, I think we're going to have to assess, but we also have to make sure that we're providing for that social emotional component and the need to readjust to being in a classroom. Because kids, there are kids who are afraid now. They watch the news. 500,000 dead is an astronomical number. And kids that have picked that up and internalized that, that can be a very scary piece depending on your age. I think it's a very scary piece, and I'm an adult. So I don't know. That's a long-winded answer to a very short question. Sorry.
Thank you, Gwen.
Never invite us in because we just talking. It's terrible. So are there any other questions before I move forward? Okay, we're going to go a little faster because we have a lot to do. So these are the decisions, and what I will do is I will send you this as a PDF tomorrow so that you have it, so you can go through it at your leisure, and then you always have it as a resource. So I'm not going to go through this in really great detail. These are the 4 decisions that came out in 2020 where they were found, there were violations found. One was for failure to report all income. That's not terribly interesting, but it's there because we'd like to point out to you, you need to make sure you do that thoroughly and completely. The second one is important. It was in regard to a teacher parent sending an email to the full board about the superintendent's handling of a child's incident. A board member intended to email the board, but hit reply all. And as a consequence, the parent and the teacher received the board member's email, which included details of the board's executive session. Okay. Again, email can be a slippery slope. You need to be very careful. Never hit reply all, ever, when you're sending a board email. Only use your board email for district business. Do not commingle your personal email and your district email, because if there's an open public records request, your Oprah officer is going to have to go through your personal email. Your employer might not be very happy with that. If there's proprietary information that might be contained on your device, if you've used a device that you use for work and you've done district business. So try to keep the 2 separate if you possibly can. That's why we recommend board members have a district email address. Keep in mind that all emails and texts are discoverable. So anything you put in an email, anything you put in a text is discoverable under the Open Public Records Act. So again, be very circumspect about what it is you put in an email or what it is you put in a text. If you're not prepared to see it on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer, don't put it in a text and don't put it in an email. Okay. A board member posted on a blog, and here's where social media can become problematic, contain deliberate repeated attacks on the qualifications and general employment of a tenured teacher in the district. And while he said he was speaking only for himself and not for the board, he referenced the fact that he was a board member several times in the blog. And again, he was not protecting school personnel in the proper performance of their duties. The recommendation was a 6-month suspension from the Board of Education. Okay. Do not belong to any closed Facebook groups, because you don't know who belongs to them. You could end up with a quorum of the board on a closed Facebook group without knowing, and then you would be in violation of the Open Public Meetings Act. So do not belong to any private closed Facebook groups of Cherry Hill folks. You know, if it's like Veterinarians of America, you're probably pretty safe. But again, any local closed Facebook group, you know, or anything having, you know, United Accountants of America or, you know, something like that is probably not a problem. You're not going to find 8 other board members in Cherry Hill or 4 other on that same Facebook group, but you could on a local Facebook group. So you should try, just don't get on there. And, you know, there's a difference between campaigning for election and running for election and then governing. And once you are sworn in, anything that you said in the campaign that you were going to do, that's fine, but you're now a board member and you have to abide by the, you know, the code of ethics. And again, social media is not the place to be discussing board business. That gets done at the board table. You know, anything that you write on social media can be hacked, can be forwarded. It's just, you just need to be careful. And the Ethics Commission actually has reached out to us because they are receiving so many complaints from members of the public about board members' inappropriate use of social media, either to attack each other or to attack issues, or other kinds of things. So please be mindful of that. This other particular case, and this goes to privilege, there was a district up north, very far north, where they sent their high school kids out to a high school in New York as opposed to another New Jersey district. And the commissioner came in and saw what the tuition was and the cost to bus these kids and said, that send-receive relationship's over. Here, you're going to send your kids to a high school in New Jersey. The board president encouraged, supported, and had the board pass a resolution that would authorize the send-receive with the out-of-state district because her child was a senior. And she was very upset that the child was not going to be able to finish her last year of school in the school where she had been in high school. The commissioner, the SEC's options were limited because she had not run for re-election. She came off the board, but the SEC had very strong language in the decision that indicated if it were possible, they would have removed her permanently from the board. Okay, because it was in direct violation to the order of the commissioner. Okay, a board member attended an all expense paid conference. I don't think I have to spend any time discussing this with you. It was not a conference that was educational. It was provided by a vendor. Board members, again, are not involved with vendors that provide services to the school district, whether it's technology, buses, basketballs, no matter what, books, anything. You are not involved in any of that. And so he used his position to gain a free out-of-state trip. Again, he was suspended for 6 months. The board member is appealing. That appeal is not yet decided, but he is off the board, I guess, through the appeals process. Okay. In terms of conflict of interest, you cannot have a business interest. And if you do with the district, you may not engage in discussion. You may not vote on it. You may not use your position to secure unwanted privileges, which we've talked about. You cannot take any gift or favor that is offered with the intent to influence. You should not have any personal involvement that creates a benefit that is better for you than it, or a member of your family, than it is for any other member of the community. You should not engage in any service or employment that might prejudice your independent judgment. And in this particular instance around conflict of interest, the definition for a family member is only your spouse or dependent child, meaning that they live in your house and they depend upon you for income, okay, as opposed to a non-dependent child who is grown up, okay? But under the other conflicts of interest areas, they have a broader definition of relative, and this is the definition of relative that actually comes from the nepotism policy. And so it includes everyone that you're essentially related to, whether by, whether it's your family, your spouse, your civil union or partner, by blood, marriage, or adoption. So aunts, uncles, grandparents, stepchildren, half brothers, half sisters, sister-in-laws, brothers-in-laws, parents, step-parents, step-grandparents, pick someone. Other than about third cousins, it's anyone you're related to. And so what that means is if you have any of those relatives that are employed in your school district in any capacity, whether they are a teacher, a bus driver, a secretary, an administrator, they may not take part in employment matters regarding the chief school administrator. They may not take part in any search for a new superintendent, have anything to do with setting terms and conditions of employment, or evaluate the superintendent. But I don't think you have any conflicted members on your board, okay? In terms of collective bargaining.
Wait, can I just pause you for a minute? Ms. Stern has her hand up, I think. about
Yes,
one
I'm
of the
sorry.
relevant slides.
Yes,
Sorry, actually, I'm sorry. Go ahead and perhaps you'll answer it so in the next slide. So I'll hold off. Thank you.
okay. In terms of bargaining, if you have a spouse, a dependent child, a child who's not a dependent, or a relative who works in the district, you may not participate in negotiations. You may not vote to ratify a contract. And that's for any bargaining unit within your district. So if you have multiple bargaining units, the teachers, the administrators, some districts have separate bargaining units for other groups of employees, such as maintenance and transportation. That goes for all bargaining units. If the relationship is yourself, your spouse, or your dependent child, and you work in another school district, but has the same or similar statewide union, and that would include AFT, American Federation of Teachers, AFL-CIO, and there are even some districts with Teamsters unions. You may not participate in negotiations, but you may vote on the contract once the memorandum of agreement is finished and all the salary guides are done and the contract is costed out, absent any other conflict. If you have a child who's not a dependent or a relative from that whole list that I gave you from the nepotism that works out of district, yes, you may participate in negotiations, and yes, you may vote to ratify the contract absent another conflict. And that other conflict would be what is called heightened union activity. So if your family member who works in another district, meaning it's you or your spouse or your dependent child, is on the bargaining team of that district where they're working, if they're a building rep in the association in the district where they're working, if they're a union officer in the district where they're working, that's considered heightened union activity and you would be not able to vote on the contract, okay? If you have any questions regarding this, your board attorney is the final arbiter of these conflicts, but we try to outline them for you to help you understand. Miriam.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So just a quick question. So we also have, like, in terms of any committee work, so if you are married to a teacher, can you be involved in, like, we like personnel matters, like HR committee or anything like that? I mean, I understand about the, obviously, negotiations, it's pretty straightforward. And contract.
Again, if you're sitting on the HR committee, I don't see that there'd be any overlap with their employment with another district. It is only in the area of negotiations. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. I just want to make this one other point. Here's an advisory that went back to A1018. This was a significant change. Endorsement of a candidate by a local education association or the statewide union does not create a per se, which means automatic, future conflict unless the financial contribution is given and is intended to influence the member. It used to be that the School Ethics Commission held that if a board member was endorsed by the Teachers Association, either the local or the statewide association, for the first year of their board service, they could not participate in negotiations. So what we have seen as a result of this, there seems to be this trend that we're now seeing that in many districts, the Teachers Association are not endorsing any incumbents, but rather endorsing all newcomers with the notion that the incumbents are going to be more difficult to negotiate with than brand new board members, okay? And so that has created some significant issues in some districts, okay? There was one instance where a district by design endorsed every incumbent and gave them like $42,000 to campaign. Yeah, I mean, spent a significant amount of money, which is a little unbelievable, but true. And so the couple of incumbents who are left on the board are going, we don't have that kind of money to run for reelection. And they're long serving board members in a stable community. And so that seems to be a trend. I'm hoping that it reverses itself, but it can be unfortunate because boards of education are generally best when there's a good mix of folks. And by that, I mean, when you have people who have been board members and have institutional memory, but at the same time, you have new folks who have new ideas and who might challenge the status quo and shake things up perhaps a little bit, but having a balance of new and, I'm not going to say old because I'm old, experienced board members. And this is creating, some waves, which is really unfortunate. It's interesting because in the 1970s, which I understand was 1,000 years ago, there was a study done by the Pennsylvania Education Association, and they decided to promote, and they did, having teachers run for Board of Education seats in the communities where they lived, not where they worked, right? And so there were several years where boards of education had lots of teachers on them. And they did a study and they found that negotiations were more difficult when the board had more teachers than when they had less teachers. And so PEA, Pennsylvania Education Association, stopped endorsing teachers for running for boards of education because they found that teachers were tougher on other teachers than non-teachers who were board members, which I thought was fascinating. But that study is pretty old and, times change and circumstances change. So the Doctrine of Necessity is a legal document. You don't have to worry about this because you don't have a lot of conflicts on your boards. I have some boards where there is a majority of the board that is conflicted out of participation in the superintendent's evaluation. So there are only 2 or 3 board members who can evaluate the superintendent, which seems patently unfair, but the School Ethics Commission has held that it's okay. You can do a search with 2 board members. You can evaluate a superintendent with 3 board members, and you don't need to invoke the doctrine. But the doctrine is there to allow you, when you have to hire a superintendent, if you have a majority is conflicted, you can do that, or approve a teacher's contract if you have board members conflicted out because of negotiations problems. Volunteerism, last topic. School board members are not banned from volunteering in their schools, but there are important considerations to make. This did not exist when I was a board member. In truth, these decisions are relatively new. I will tell you, I probably would not have done half the things that I was doing if these rules existed at that point in time. But you can volunteer for activities that support your children. So you can hold an executive position with your PTA or your home school or your PTO, whatever you call that organization in each school. You can be an officer. But you should refrain from certain activities based on the involvement with students or staff, the degree to which the school board member has authority to either give or receive directions to or from students or to staff. So board members who volunteer in the schools should advise the superintendent of their planned in-school volunteer activity in advance if it is more than a one-shot deal. If you're just going in because you were invited to give a talk at the high school for a career day or whatever you call that these days, you don't need to notify the superintendent. If you're reading for Read Across America, you've been invited by your, the kindergarten teacher to do that or the first grade teacher, not a problem. If you're invited to be a chaperone or asked if you can chaperone a field trip, you can certainly do that. But you do not want to be enmeshed in the school building. You do not want to be giving direction to or taking direction from staff. And you do not want to be giving direction to students, okay? Which clearly means you can no longer be a volunteer coach or a volunteer club advisor. And again, in a lot of the smaller school districts, we had board members that, were volunteer coaches, volunteer activity advisors, primarily at the elementary school. I had a board member who had been on the board close to 20 years, and he ran for the elementary school a stamp collecting club, okay? Which is not something, like I have, and maybe some of you do have, or maybe Joe may have, I have my parents' stamp collections from two sides of the family in the basement, right? Stamp collecting used to be like a big hobby. It's no longer that big a hobby anymore. People do different things. And he so loved this. He said, if I stay on the board, I won't be able to do this and the club will not be there. He so loved the kids, he resigned from the board and continued to be the stamp club advisor because he said, I'd rather do that than serve on the board. And he had been on the board for 20 years. So perhaps that was a good decision, but it was unfortunate that people have to make those kinds of choices because it wasn't a problem. But, you know, sometimes they use a sledgehammer to address a problem that would be better to use a fly swatter. And in this instance, they've used a sledgehammer. So, you know, here are a series of questions that you can ask yourself. And if you can say no to all of these, then it's probably okay for you to volunteer for the school. You're not taking orders from staff. You're not in the schools often. If a parent comes in and sees you there, they're not going to think you're part of the staff. You're not handling any district funds or monies. You know, my kids were little, I used to run the school store and the kids would buy erasers and pencils and little notebooks and tchotchke things that, you know, were a quarter or 50 cents. And I would collect the money. I was home and I could be there at lunchtime and I did that one day a week. And I turned the money over to the PTO. I mean, it didn't raise a lot of money, but the kids loved it and they bought stickers and all kinds of things. I wouldn't be allowed to do that as a board member now. So you can belong to as many outside organizations as you want. Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, Park and Recs, you can be a coach, Pop Warner, the Soccer Association, if you have one in town, or the Lacrosse Association. Anything that has separate bylaws, a separate treasury, and that is not tied in any way to the school, you can participate as much as you want to your heart's content. But, you know, there are lots of board members who were very upset about some of these decisions because they had been actively involved in the schools. And again, typically that's where a lot of our board members come from. You know, they were active in the schools and they got interested in the process and then they became board members and now they're being told you can't be in the schools anymore. I'm not suggesting you should be in the schools 24/7. If you want to visit the schools, you need to let your superintendent know. Again, board members should not be wandering through school buildings unless you have a reason to be there. If you're a parent and you're going to a teacher conference, that's appropriate. If it's a public event and you're going to the science fair and it's open to everyone, go. But you should not be wandering through schools because you're no different once you're away from this advertised meeting of the board than any other citizen in the community. And we know for safety and security reasons, our schools are not open free places where people can just wander. So board members fall under that very same proviso. When you go into a school, if you have a reason to be there, you need to sign in, you need to abide by all of the rules and regulations of every school that maintain the safety and security of the schools. Not really applicable now if your schools are not in full time, but when they are, you need to make sure that you abide by all of those things as well.
And I think Ms. Friedel has a question.
Just a clarification. So let's say your child is in theater, right?
Yes.
And you want to volunteer the night of the play. So if you're a board member, you should not be volunteering to sell the refreshments because money is changing hands. You should volunteer to be like in the costume room.
Yes.
Supervising kids or whatever.
Yes, that would be fine. And that's a one-night event or a two-night event. Okay.
But just don't collect money.
Don't collect money.
Okay.
You know, I had another board member who actually was involved in theater. And actually one of the cases that generated this, and you will appreciate this, was this case, actually the first volunteerism case came out of a teacher whose husband was a board member. And he was helping her with the sets because they were heavy and they were wooden, okay? And so he was really constructing the sets for the theater, for the production. Tried to tell your wife you weren't gonna help. Good luck with that. And as a result of that, he was there a lot, and he would do some of this work because the stage wasn't used all the time during the course of the school day. And he would go into the lunchroom where the faculty was, okay? So, you know, that's where this case, one of these cases originated. And he became enmeshed like a part of the building, right? As opposed to just helping. Now, had he just gone in and moved sets, you know, or done it at night when there weren't students and staff in the building, and she was running a rehearsal and he was painting sets or moving them, it probably wouldn't have been an issue. But again, it was a circumstance where he was there a lot and became enmeshed in the building, and it became a problem. So, you know, you just need to be careful. And I had another board member who was making all of the costumes for the middle school productions, and she would collect money from the kids to help defray the cost of the fabric. She would do all of the sewing and whatever, but the district was not wealthy enough to provide for, you know, all of the costumes. And so parents would kick in, she would collect the money. She got off the board because she loved what she was doing. And she said, my kids are all coming up and we love theater and I'm going to keep doing it. So, in any case, that's volunteerism. Interview committees. We've issued a
Oh,
number.
Gwen, I think Corinne had a question about sports teams and sports clubs.
Yes, please.
If that was the same.
Yeah, is that the same? Thank you, Mrs. Mary. Is that rule apply for like sports teams? Like, you know, like if your kid's on the team, but I don't know if that's school run, but like I can't volunteer to be the snack person anymore or coordinating the banquets and whatnot, or
You certainly can you certainly can volunteer as long as it's not connected to the school. If it's an intramural team, you know, at the middle school, or even a competitive team at the middle school or high school, you cannot be a volunteer coach. Again, you cannot run the snack bar. You could volunteer to help serve. You know, you can belong to the booster club through the high school and volunteer, and work a Saturday at a football game, you know, throwing French fries at kids and collecting that money. It's not a big deal. But you shouldn't be out purchasing the food for the snack bar, right? And exchanging district funds. There is a difference. They're trying to make board members feel better. Originally, they've loosened up. Originally, it was a lot tighter than it is right now. So I think if you're a booster club parent, that's not a problem. You certainly can do that. But again, and if it's park and recreations, or it's a private association, soccer association, in my town, there's also like a cheerleading group that goes with Pop Warner. Those are all fine. The Girl Scouts, the Boy Scouts, any other kind of volunteer organization that helps kids that's not affiliated with the school district is fine for you to volunteer as much as you want. Okay, does that answer your question?
yes.
Because I'm sharing my screen.
Thank you.
So we recommend that if you have conflicted board members, you sort of keep a list and update it regularly. Again, consult with your board attorney if you have questions. He is obviously the final arbiter, or she, and continue to check school board notes to keep abreast of newly released advisory opinions. I will send you this PowerPoint so that you have it. We've included links to all of the cases. You can go online and read all of these if you would like, because they're all available to you online and you can read any of them. And we've included all of the links. Some board members think it's like watching wallpaper dry. I find it interesting, but it is my job. So
Gwen, did you go through the interview slide?
did I do that too fast? I probably skipped it. I beg your pardon. I will go back.
Okay. I know it's late and I'm tired, but
No, thank you. Thank you. Both of us, it's late and I'm tired too, but board member involvement in interviews for positions other than superintendents. are not encouraged. They made that decision. Then they turned around and came out and made another one that said 1 or 2 board members that is administration, the superintendent coordinates, may participate for administrative positions only, not teachers. Observations and assessments only, not interviewing, not participating in the questioning, but you may observe and you may make your own assessment for high-level administrative positions only, and only with the permission of your chief school administrator. But the SEC discourages it. So typically, boards only get involved in interviews for hiring of superintendents and business administrators, board secretaries, because that person is your board secretary, even though they report to the superintendent in a unitary position as a BA/BS, unless you have separate people in 2 jobs, which some big districts do, but you don't. And yet on the flip side, you may not participate in any exit interviews that are conducted in your school district. So, you know, these things have not encouraged, these have morphed and evolved over time, was the word I was looking for. And so they're like in diametric opposition. So our legal staff, when they came out with A3115 and A412, was absolutely shocked, because it makes no sense in conjunction with A1510. If you can observe hiring, why couldn't you observe people leaving, right? There's no coherence. And so that has to do with the membership of the SEC, and I'm not knocking them, but different people over time have different perspectives on these issues. So that's why I make that point to you, not to denigrate the SEC, because they're volunteering their time and they're doing a great job, but rather to point out to you that things do shift over time, which is why it's important for board members to stay up to date and current. So thank you, because I zipped right through that and I didn't mean to.
Can I ask one quick question about the SEC?
Yes, please.
Are there term limits to those
3 years.
members?
3 years.
So 3 years, and then a new person comes in, so they don't keep rolling.
They're staggered.
Right, but the members, like if you're on it for 3 years and then someone new comes in? Or can you do another 3 years?
You can do another couple of years. One board member has been on there for as long as I can remember.
And they're governor appointed?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they are governor appointed. They don't have to be approved by the legislature, but they're governor appointed. So as administrations change, typically the membership of the SEC changes, but sometimes not, and sometimes not all at once. I don't think it's on anyone's top 10 list of organizations that people are watching, you know, like carefully. And that's not to say that they need to be watched carefully, but I don't think it raises to the level of concern, because there are checks and balances. The commissioner has to approve the recommendations. And again, you saw this past year, out of 24 complaints, there were only 4 adjudicated to have been violations. So, you know, it's not as though they are overwhelmed with those issues. And when issues do pop up, for example, they then work with us and we work with them to help address it. So, for example, we have seen a real rise in the misuse of social media and inappropriate comments by board members and so forth on social media. I'm sure some of you have seen it. Some of you may have been victims of it. And so we have a program on board member use of social media. My simple statement is just don't do it, which I know makes me probably sound old and fuddy-duddied, but it's very safe. And I always urge on the side of being cautious rather than living on the edge. And engaging in social media can be it's very helpful. I'm not saying you shouldn't have a Twitter account, It's a wonderful tool for communication and putting out information that's factual and accurate. But unfortunately, as a society, in many ways, it's been weaponized and weaponized against people. It's one of the things that, has caused real problems for students, particularly, where it's very easy to bully and harass and intimidate other students through the use of social media. So it can be very, very detrimental. So board members, again, as state officials, need to be very judicious in their approach to utilizing social media. So my best answer is, if you think it could be a problem, don't put it up. So I'm going to stop sharing. We still have some time left. We have board norms to do. I know we were only going to run till 8 o'clock. Would you all like to take a few minute humanity break before we start talking about norms?
Gwen, how long do we think it'll take to do norms? I'm wondering if we have time, because we've had a lot of very long meetings. So I want to be mindful of everybody's time tonight, or do we do it in another session?
I think we're going to need to do it in another session, because I think it will generate a lot of discussion. I think it's
Okay.
and I think we need to do it. I'm certainly willing to stay on and do it. But again, I know you've had a lot of long meetings, because there's no board meeting anymore that's short. The upside to this is we've gotten a lot more public attendance at our public meetings, which I think is a plus, because I think it's helped to educate folks to what the role of the board is, what you can do, what you can't do, and some of those pieces which we've all bemoaned for years, that the public doesn't exactly know what it is you can and can't do, and why it can be done or can't be done. But at the same time, it's also elongated your meetings
Yeah.
geometrically. So any other questions that I can answer for you if we don't begin?
Ms. Stern has her, when Ms. Stern has her hand?
Ms. Stern, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you. Could you please repeat what you said regarding the board administrator, I'm sorry, the business administrator and board secretary? You said something on the slide regarding interview. I don't know what I didn't
Okay.
get it. So you
Some
repeat it. Thank you.
districts have, some very large districts have a board secretary and a business administrator. Most districts have, it's a unified position. So the superintendent evaluates the business administrator / board secretary, but because the board secretary works on behalf of the board and you work so closely with that individual, that would be an example of an administrator where board member participation would be appropriate.
The interview process, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. Okay.
That's what I'm saying.
Thanks for answering that.
That's all I'm saying. And in a district where they weren't combined, you would only be doing the board secretary, not the BA / board secretary. Okay. Because the board secretary works for the board, does all your meetings and the budget, thankless task, which you're about to begin. So, okay.
Were there other questions?
Any other questions? Just informationally, I will include when I will send it to you, but I will, if you don't have it, I will send you all of my contact information. I spend my days talking to board members and my evenings doing meetings. It is what I do. I answer questions. I get information together for folks. Your conversations with me are confidential. I don't call up your board president and say, guess what Ben told me? Or guess what Carol told me? Or guess what Sally said? I don't tell your administration. So you can ask me any question you want. You can call me and just vent if that's what you want to do. We spend a lot of time on the phone. I love what I do. I think I have the best job in the world. I used to teach kids in 43-minute periods, in a 9-period day, and eat my lunch in 22 minutes, because that's how high schools ran when I was a teacher. I now get to work with people who are volunteering their time, who care deeply about kids, who are doing important work in education, and who want to do who want to be better board members. So they're calling and asking questions. What could be better? And for me, it's the best of all worlds. So I love what I do. And so you're always welcome to call or send me an email or send me a text. I will get back to you. I always get back to my board members. I'm really very good about that. And I think what you're doing makes a huge difference. January was Board Appreciation Month. So and if you didn't get that message, on behalf of the officers and our entire association, thank you for the work that you are doing. It is not gratuitous language on my part to say, from my perspective, you really are first responders in keeping the school and the educational system going for kids in a time of great uncertainty. If I feel that way and uncertain as an adult, I can only imagine what kids must feel. So thank you for the work that you are doing. It's very important. Okay. Stay well, stay healthy, take care of each other, be kind to one another. None of us knows what everybody's dealing with, you know, in your own families and who's impacted. And I think that kindness and care for one another is critically important during these times. So thank you very much. I look forward
Thank you, Gwen.
again soon, and we'll schedule something and do your norms. Okay.
That's great. Thank you,
Yeah.
Gwen.
Thank you,
All
Gwen.
right.
Thank you so
very
much.
much.
Bye. Have a good
Great to see
evening.
you.
All
Bye,
right.
Gwen.
Good to see you. Bye.
Well, I believe we have a public comment period, Dr. Malash, and we have a few folks in the audience if we want to do that now.
Yes, now's a good time.
I don't see hands raised, but I want to wait. I don't want to move too fast and not provide.
And Mrs. Sugars, I don't believe you received anything in email ahead of time.
No, I did not.
Okay. Okay, well, I'll give it a last call on public comment. Otherwise, if none of the board members had anything else, we can move to adjourn. All right, I'm going to move to adjourn so that we can end one meeting perfectly on time. Do I have a second?
A second.
Mrs. Schultz, all in favor? All right, great. Thanks, everybody.
Fine, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Night.
Great discussion.